On April 18, 1906, at 5:12 in the morning, an earthquake struck San Francisco. The shaking lasted less than a minute. The fires that followed burned for 3 days. By the time the smoke cleared, an estimated 500 city blocks had been reduced to ash. At least 3,000 people were dead. Roughly 400,000 residents, more than half the city's population, had lost their homes. And somewhere in the rubble of the Hall of Records on Kearny Street, 1,549 books of official county records had turned to ash. That number is documented. It comes from the county archivist's accounting of the loss. It is not disputed. What that number meant and what began happening in San Francisco in the days and weeks that followed is a story most official histories pass over in a single paragraph. It deserves considerably more than that. Before April 18, 1906, San Francisco held one of the most complete municipal archive systems on the Pacific coast. The Hall of Records stood at the corner of Kearny and Washington Streets. It was a stone and iron structure considered fireproof by the standards of the time. Inside it, the county's complete record of births, marriages, deaths, property deeds, and naturalization filings. Some of those records dated back to the 1850s. The Spanish colonial documents housed in adjacent city buildings stretched back further still. An estimated 300,000 documents covering California under Spanish and Mexican rule, covering land grants, military orders, mission records, and correspondence across more than 2 centuries. These were not administrative curiosities. They were identity infrastructure. In an era before nationally standardized identity documents, before social security numbers, before federal ID systems, before centralized digital databases, local vital records were the primary mechanism by which a person could prove who they were, where they had been born, and what legal claims they held. A birth record was not merely a piece of paper. It was the documentary foundation on which citizenship, inheritance, and legal standing rested. San Francisco in 1906 had a population of approximately 400,000 people. Among them, a substantial Chinese immigrant community. Chinatown occupied roughly 12 city blocks near the commercial center of the city, bordered by California, Kearny, Broadway, and Stockton streets. Its population is estimated to have been between 10,000 and 14,000 residents. It was, by 1906, one of the oldest and largest Chinese communities in the Western Hemisphere outside of Asia, a community that had been building itself in San Francisco since the 1850s. They lived under a legal architecture that had been specifically designed to contain them. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It barred Chinese laborers from entering the United States. It prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens. It required Chinese residents already living in the country to carry certificates of residence, identity papers that no other immigrant group in American history was legally required to carry. It was renewed in 1892, made permanent in 1902. By April of 1906, it had been in active force for 24 years. The act had one structural vulnerability. In 1898, the United States Supreme Court decided United States v. Wong Kim Ark. The court ruled 6-2 that any person born on American soil was a citizen of the United States by birthright, regardless of the citizenship status or ethnicity of their parents. The ruling had been contested. Some immigration officials had argued that children born to Chinese parents should not be considered birthright citizens. The Supreme Court held otherwise. What this meant in narrow practical terms was significant. A Chinese person born in San Francisco was a citizen. As a citizen, they could not be excluded. As a citizen, they could travel to China and return. And crucially, as a citizen, they had the legal right to report dependent children living overseas and petition for those children to enter the United States. To exercise any of those rights, you needed one thing. You needed a birth record. Those records were kept in the Hall of Records. On April 18, 1906, the Hall of Records ceased to exist. The earthquake struck before dawn. The initial shaking, estimated at 7.9 magnitude, caused immediate structural damage across the city. Gas lines fractured. Water mains broke. Fires started in multiple locations within the first hour. One of the most destructive fires started in the Hayes Valley neighborhood, at the corner of Hayes and Gough Streets. A woman, unaware that her chimney had been cracked by the quake, lit her stove to prepare breakfast. The fire caught. It spread through damaged buildings and traveled across dry rubble. By the time it was contained, it had consumed approximately 30 city blocks, including a college, San Francisco's City Hall, and the Hall of Records. The fires burned for 3 days. What was lost inside the Hall of Records by the county archivist's accounting 1,549 volumes of recorded documents, including all birth, marriage, and death records maintained by the county recorder's office. More than 1,400 additional volumes of mortgages and property records, naturalization filings, court documents, decades of accumulated vital records. There was no off-site backup. There was no duplicate set held at a state or federal facility. There was no federal copy. The birth register for San Francisco simply stopped. The documentary record of who had been born in this city and what legal status that birth conferred did not exist anymore. Think about what that meant in practical terms, standing in the ruins of Chinatown on April 22, 1906. The air still carries smoke. The streets are covered in ash and the carbonized remains of wooden structures that had stood there for decades. The homes and shops that lined Grant Avenue are gone. The community that had occupied those 12 blocks has been displaced into emergency camps in Golden Gate Park and at the Presidio. But the absence is not only physical. The certificates of residence that the Exclusion Act had required Chinese residents to carry, gone. The immigration filings linking specific individuals to specific legal statuses, largely gone. The birth records that could prove or disprove birthright citizenship claims, gone. The archive that had been used for 24 years as a mechanism of legal exclusion had been destroyed, and within weeks, federal documentation shows what happened next began. Bureau of Immigration records from 1906 and 1907 document that shortly after the fires, large numbers of Chinese residents of San Francisco came forward to declare themselves U.S.-born citizens whose documentation had been destroyed in the disaster. They approached immigration officials. They stated under oath that they had been born in San Francisco, that their birth records had been housed in the Hall of Records, and that they were requesting documentation of their citizenship. With the records gone, there was no ready mechanism to verify or disprove these claims. In most cases, citizenship was granted. This was the opening. Once a man had established legal citizenship, the mechanism that followed was straightforward under existing immigration law. A US-born citizen had the right to report dependent children living overseas. He could file paperwork naming those children, providing their ages and claimed locations. Those named children could then apply for legal entry into the United States as the dependent offspring of a citizen. The slots were legally real. The children they named, in a significant number of cases, were not. Across San Francisco's Chinatown and through networks extending into Chinese communities along the California coast, what began circulating were available slots. A slot was a documented child identity attached to a registered U.S. citizen filed with immigration authorities, legally actionable. It could be purchased by a family in China who needed to send a son or a daughter, though sons were far more common to America. The price has been documented in period equivalent terms at approximately $100 per year of the buyer's claimed age, meaning a young man claiming to be 20 years old would pay approximately $2,000 in the currency of the time. A substantial sum equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today. Each purchased slot came with a coaching package. The coaching package was a handwritten document, sometimes multiple documents bound together, that contained everything the buyer would need to convincingly inhabit the identity they had purchased. These papers survive. They are held in boxes at the National Archives facility in San Francisco, catalogued under the broader category of seized immigration materials. Researchers working in those archives have described finding them in a box labeled simply coaching papers. What the coaching papers contained was specific in a way that formal historical documents rarely are. They did not deal in abstractions. They simulated lived experience. The papers would include the name of the village the citizen claimed to be from and the number of households in that village, the layout of the family compound, the direction the main gate faced, the number of steps from the road to the front door, the location of the kitchen relative to the sleeping quarters, the names of the neighbors immediately to the left and right, the name of the local school and the teacher's name, the citizen's full family tree, father, mother, grandparents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles with their ages, occupations, and village positions, the exact dates of the citizen's recorded trips to China, the ages and names of the children at the time of each trip, the name of the midwife who had allegedly delivered the children, the name of the rice merchant on the market road nearest the family compound. These were not general summaries. They were designed to pass interrogation. The buyer would spend the weeks of the Pacific voyage studying them. Before the ship entered San Francisco Bay, the papers were destroyed, thrown overboard, burned in the ship's boiler room, torn into pieces, and dropped into the ocean one by one. The buyer arrived at Angel Island carrying nothing that could connect them to the fabricated history. But they had memorized the history. The Angel Island Immigration Station opened in San Francisco Bay in January 1910. For the next 3 decades, until it was itself destroyed by fire in 1940, it served as the primary processing point for immigrants arriving on the Pacific coast. Between its opening and its closure, it processed an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 people. The experience was not uniform. European immigrants arriving at Ellis Island on the east coast could typically be processed and cleared within hours if they were in good health and their documents were in order. Chinese arrivals at Angel Island were detained. They were held in wooden barracks that smelled, by the accounts of those who spent time in them, of mold and salt air and the prolonged anxiety of waiting. They were medically examined. They were interrogated. The interrogations had become more systematic over time as immigration officials grew aware of how thoroughly the coaching paper system had taken hold. Inspectors knew that a prepared paper son could pass surface-level questioning. So the questions went deeper. They would ask, how many windows are on the north-facing wall of your family's home in China? Which direction does the kitchen face? What is the full name of the man who lives 2 doors to the left of your father's house? Is there water near the house, a pond, a stream, a well? How far from the front door?
What is your mother's maiden name? What did your father do on the morning of a specific date during a recorded visit to China?
The answers had to match not just the claimed family identity, but the prior testimony the original citizen had given to inspectors during previous entries into the country. Immigration officials maintained detailed case files. If a man claiming to be Li Yi's son said there were 4 windows on the north wall of the house, and Li Yi had previously said there were 3, that discrepancy went into the record. It could trigger extended detention, further interrogation, or deportation. Some coaching papers were thorough enough to pass. National Archives case files contain records of detainees who were questioned for days and weeks, who answered every question correctly, and who were eventually cleared and admitted. Others were not thorough enough. Some arrivals were detained for months. Some were deported for inconsistencies so small a wrong number of steps, a reversed compass direction, that the margin between staying and being sent back seems almost arbitrary. Some of those who were detained carved their feelings into the wooden walls of the barracks. Poetry, mostly. The carvings are still there. The walls were preserved after the station closed and are accessible to visitors today. The ones who passed took their paper names and entered the country. Many of them kept those names for the rest of their lives. Their children were born with those names. Their grandchildren carry them. Here is what the record does not fully contain. The precise number of fraudulent citizenship claims filed in the weeks and months immediately following the 1906 earthquake has never been formally established. The Bureau of Immigration tracked what they described as statistical impossibilities, the most frequently cited figure being that if every citizenship claim filed by Chinese residents after 1906 was legitimate, then every Chinese woman living in California before the earthquake would have needed to have given birth to between 500 and 600 sons, no daughters, just sons. That observation appears in federal immigration documentation from the period. It was not filed in secret. It was used as an internal measure of how extensively the claims had exceeded any plausible demographic reality. The response was to increase interrogation rigor to make Angel Island harder to pass. What the government did not do was go back and invalidate the original claims made in the spring and summer of 1906. Those cases were already processed. The new citizenships were already on file. The slots had already been filed and in many cases already sold. The California genealogical record for pre-1906 San Francisco births is, by the assessment of archivists who have worked with it, largely absent. Some partial death ledgers survived. A small number of church records were preserved by individual clergy who removed them from their buildings before or during the fires. Some birth announcements were published in newspapers and can be located through newspaper archive searches. But the systematic vital record, the register that a genealogist, an immigration inspector, or an identity researcher could consult to verify who was born in this city and when, does not exist before April 18, 1906. The California legislature passed a law in June 1906 to help establish title to real property in cases where deeds had been destroyed. There was a mechanism to redocument land ownership. No equivalent mechanism was created for personal identity documentation. The birth register was not reconstructed. The window was not formally closed. In 1956, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service launched what it called the Chinese Confession Program. Chinese Americans who had entered the country under false identities, or whose parents had, were encouraged to come forward, confess their true names and origins, and have their legal status regularized. The program ran until 1965. The response was, in the NS's own assessment, limited. The Chinese Exclusion Act had been repealed in 1943. The immediate legal danger had diminished. But the calculation for a paper son, considering confession, was not simple. A paper identity was not a single document. It was a tree. The same fictitious family branch had often been used to bring in multiple people, brothers, cousins, children, family friends, over a span of years or even decades. Confessing required naming all of them. Every person who had entered through that branch would have their immigration status placed under scrutiny. The INS program acknowledged this directly. Confessors were required to provide a full accounting of all paper relatives, both those already in the United States and any remaining unused slots still in circulation. The false names were structural. They were holding up the documented lives of multiple people. Established mistrust of immigration authorities within the Chinese American community, a mistrust built over 70 years of exclusion enforcement, interrogation, and deportation, compounded the hesitation. A minority of Chinese Americans participated in the program. Those who did largely obtained legal status. Those who did not left no trace in this particular archive. The gap in the confession program files is shaped exactly like the gap in the birth records from 1906. It is an absence that indicates something was there. What happened in San Francisco between 1906 and 1943 is not without precedent in the broader history of official record destruction. After the Civil War, the reconstruction of documentary identity for formerly enslaved people required building personal records from whatever fragments remained. Church records, newspaper notices, plantation documents, oral testimony. The official archive had never fully intended to record those lives in the first place, and what emerged in the gap between what was recorded and what was real was not clean. Birth years were estimated. Names were reconstructed or invented from partial memory. The record that exists for many African American family trees from that era stops at a wall and then resumes on the other side with a new name and an approximate date. In post-World War II Europe, displaced persons moved into identities recovered from the dead, the missing, and the administratively vanished. Entire national record systems had been bombed, burned, or deliberately destroyed. The administrative chaos of collapsed bureaucracies created temporary windows in which documented identity was, practically speaking, available for reconstruction. The pattern is consistent. When the official record is destroyed, the legal system that depended on that record to enforce a particular order is temporarily suspended. People who were being controlled, excluded, or surveilled by that record sometimes move into the space the record left behind. In the case of San Francisco in 1906, the Chinese Exclusion Act had used the archive as a tool of enforcement for 24 years. It had required Chinese residents to carry documentation that no other immigrant group was required to carry. It had built its entire enforcement mechanism around records, census data, immigration files, certificates of residence, court documents. When the archive burned, the tool broke. The federal government framed what followed as fraud. That framing is accurate, legally. It is also incomplete as a historical description. The coaching papers are in the National Archives. The statistical impossibility of the citizenship claims was noted at the time by federal officials. The confession program files document some portion of what occurred. This is not a history that was classified, buried, or officially erased. It is a history that remains structurally difficult to center in an institutional narrative, because centering it requires asking what the record system was being used for before it burned, who built it, and whose movement and presence it was designed to constrain. There are people alive today who know that the name they carry is a paper name, a purchased name. A name that came from a handwritten document thrown into the Pacific Ocean sometime before their grandfather or great-grandfather walked down the gangway at Angel Island. Some of those families have found the coaching papers in the National Archives. They have found village records in Guangdong province. They have matched the handwriting in the coaching papers to nothing at all, because the people who wrote them died before anyone thought to ask. There are also families who do not know, who have no reason to suspect, who carry a name and assume, as most people do, that a name is something given by birth, something inherited, something real in the way that documented things are supposed to be real. The Hall of Records burned on April 18, 1906. The 1,549 books of records it contained were not reconstructed. The birth registers were not replaced. The identity documentation for hundreds of thousands of people in one of the most significant American cities of the early 20th century simply stopped existing. What grew in the space of that absence has never been fully counted. I wasn't looking for any of this.